Chris O'Connor here. Join our fabulous curmudgeonly community on Facebook at facebook.com/group/curmudgeonrock. Also look out for a Spotify playlist dedicated to this episode. Now, let's get started.
This is the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and this is your podcast made by rock geek iconoclastic outsiders for rock geek iconoclastic outsiders. For those of you who lament that rock music has gone the way of jazz and slipped into niche genre status, we are here to keep that flame alive by providing insight, analysis, recommendations, and honest takes, not hot takes. And hey, there's a good chance you'll learn some rock history you never knew before. As we return to our second Golden Age of Rock series, we find ourselves in the pivotal year of 1968, right before the 1960s comes crashing to an end. While the socio-cultural and political story of this year is revolution and unrest, the musical story of this year is dichotomy. On one side, bands and artists are going bigger, heavier, more psychedelic, and weirder. Both Jimi Hendrix and Cream released titanic, heavy-ass double albums. The Velvet Underground take noise rock to the extreme and further germinate the seed of punk rock that they and The Who planted a few years ago. The Pretty Things go full-on art rock by putting out a densely layered concept album that predicts both heavy metal and prog rock. And the Grateful Dead released their most whacked-out record ever, while the Beatles and Frank Zappa just get weirder. On the other side, other bands and artists are going smaller, more minimalist, and taking rock music back to its roots. The Rolling Stones, the Kinks, the Byrds, and the Band find refuge and inspiration in music from the past, drawing on different kinds of cultural heritage to create new kinds of roots-based rock. Things start to go away from flower power at this point, and new avenues of expression for rock music are still being created. The seemingly unending list of brilliant albums from this year is a testament to that. Welcome to the Curmudgeon Rock Report, and welcome to the second Golden Age of Rock, 1968.
1968 was a year of brutality, chaos, and loss, what with the political riots and the assassinations of Dr. Martin Luther King and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or Robert F. Kennedy, I wish it was Jr., RFK, and also the escalation of the Vietnam War. But the tumult was decidedly low in the musical world, where we were blessed with welcome throwbacks to the American and British vernaculars on the one hand, and towering monuments to indulgence and self-indulgence on the other. As we get going with what's already becoming a year of brutality in its own right here in 2024, now is a great time to revisit 1968 now, ain't it, Arturo?
Yeah. I mean, there's some bad shit going on in the world right now. So I'm okay with going back to the comparatively not so bad, unless you're in Vietnam.
Yeah.
Perils of 1968. But really, I mean, this podcast is all about the music, and we're talking about the music. And there was some damn good fucking great music that came out this year.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. It was a really kind of a stunning year. I mean, there was a whole string of them. That's why we're doing the second Golden Age series. There's, it's like every year has its extraordinary highlights, and we're covering those in this episode. I mean, and this album is really just we're talking about albums primarily and almost exclusively. It's just like just a whole series of just great all-time records. Like no joke, like what do you figure? At least 5 of the 50 greatest records ever made probably are out this year. It's a chunk. So, well, now it's time to enter a realm where we know that great rock and roll music predominates, and I'm assuming you know where we're heading here, Arturo. Oh, wow. Martians are coming down to the parallel universe, apparently. Wow. Neato, dude. Neato. So here we are over in the parallel universe where rock is still the predominant musical art form that's on the billboards and in the arenas and on the stages of the stadiums. And it's not just a Taylor Swift world, but guys with guitars and ladies with guitars and two turntables and a microphone are up there as well. It's a great place for great music, and that's what this segment is really about. It's where Arturo and I uh, examine new and new-ish records. I say new-ish because there is a parallel vault over here in the parallel universe,
Woohoo.
and once in a while we get to pull out a nugget from our parallel vaults, as in albums released within the last decade. And we're actually doing that in this episode, but not at first. Arturo, what brand new record are you covering this week from an artist in the parallel universe?
It's the new one by Sleater-Kinney called
Oh,
Little Rope. Now, from 1995 through 2005, the band Sleater-Kinney raised the bar for politically charged punk and indie rock. They emerged from the feminist riot girl, quote unquote, scene in Olympia, Washington, with a rarity in the increasingly sterile and male punk rock world, a bold, original, highly musical style that incorporated innovative guitar work, complex rhythms, new wave pop, psychedelic rock, progressive rock, and lyrics that contained righteous political fury, scathing social commentary, and a defiantly countercultural stance. It is not an exaggeration to say that Sleater-Kinney during this period were the female counterpoint to the Clash.
yep.
And the 7 album run they had during this period is a testament to the fact that commercial success isn't and should not be the only barometer by which a band's or an artist's legacy and impact are measured. Like Fugazi before them, they had many opportunities during this time to sign to a major label and try to get themselves on the radio and or MTV, but they steadfastly refused. Instead, they did it the hard way, and it earned them a sizable cult following and an impeccable reputation for artistic integrity. They are arguably the greatest female rock and roll band of all time, and in both of these curmudgeons' opinions, there is not even a close second.
Nope.
After a 10-year hiatus, they reemerged in 2015 with a very good album in No Cities to Love. Then they hit a rough patch. They brought on alternative pop rock star St. Vincent to produce 2019's The Center Won't Hold, and it was an unmitigated disaster. Their brilliant longtime drummer, Janet Weiss, left the band shortly after recording, reportedly due to the musical direction the band was undertaking that she did not approve of. The worries were not unfounded, as
Hmm.
actually, no, it was a labored attempt at a generic cliche indie pop that felt underwritten and overproduced, and it drew the most lukewarm or worst reviews of the band's career. They came back in 2021 with the self-produced effort Path of Wellness, and it didn't really move the needle commercially nor artistically. The music felt recycled and the songwriting was uninspired. It turns out that all Corin Tucker and Carrie Brownstein, the band's leaders and dual singer-songwriter guitarists, needed was a sympathetic producer. Enter this year's Little Rope, which marks a much welcome return to form for a band I was all too ready to write off. John Congleton, a Grammy Award-winning producer and musician, brings discipline and focus to the core duo. According to Mojo magazine, Corin Tucker recounts when she brought Congleton a melody and a song idea that she had come up with. Congleton's response was that it simply wasn't good enough. Tucker, naturally, was pissed off, but she went home, worked on it, and came back with a much better song. Loss, dealing with loss, finding the will to be strong and move on are the central lyrical themes of this album, brought on by the tragic deaths of Carrie Brownstein's mother and stepfather after a car accident while they were vacationing in Italy 2 years ago. While Tucker's voice and songwriting dominate the album, really, Brownstein's guitar work achieves an understated elegance and shimmers, not to the forefront as Sleater-Kinney's usual sound requires, but around and underneath the songs, providing a support and an uplift that matches the lyrical content. Key tracks: Say It Like You Mean It, quite possibly the purest, prettiest pop song the band has ever produced. Hunt You Down, with its Talking Heads-ish groove that also recalls fellow Pacific Northwest legends Modest Mouse, with its edgy hiccup vocals, and the anti-Christian radical rant of Crusader that rocks with a fluid melody and exotic disco beat. Oh, welcome back, Sleater-Kinney. It's not the greatest album they ever did, but it is better than the previous two. They're back to doing good albums. You were missed, Chris.
Yeah, certainly not their greatest record. That's definitely what I'll say. It's definitely No Cities to Love, and yeah, there has been a fall off. Boy, does this man miss Janet Weiss.
Yes, they do. They do.
Even though the songwriting has restored, and they've found a little bit of success in oddly emulating some Kate Bushish type of sonic soundscapes with some of the drum machine stuff that's on this record. And yes, Carrie Brownstein's guitar actually is pretty nice on this. I'm a fan of the songs Hell, Small Finds, and Untidy Creature. Not surprisingly, those are probably the three most rockingest songs.
Right.
And it makes me pine for Janet Weiss, because I mean, I think it's pretty clear at this point, after a couple of records without her, that she had an obvious influence on the energy and also on the arrangements. I think that, I mean, just given the space that how she kept time and how she rumbled. I mean, it was something that like challenged Brownstein and Tucker to build their guitar arrangements around. And
Right.
so without that, I mean, I guess it's a new challenge for Brownstein to paint new corners, I suppose.
Mhm.
But man, I miss it, because the edge that they had, it's kind of akin to when Jay Bennett was fired from Wilco.
Yes.
And how he was such an influence on the sound, the arrangement, and the energy, especially the energy and the sense of purpose. Without that, Tweedy's put out some pretty good records. I mean, he's put out one very good album and one great record in 10 years,
Right.
or in 20 years, excuse me, since Bennett was dismissed. But there was a loss, and I think it's the same thing here. So it just, the good stuff, especially Hell, makes me pine for like the Woods, and or makes me pine for One More Hour from Dig Me Out, which is my favorite song by Sleater-Kinney at this point. So yeah, good record, not great. Oddly Kate Bush and Janet. Your stuff with Quasi has been great, but you've got two ladies who really, really miss you. And in my fantasy camp mind, you're back with them and rocking out again.
Yeah.
So, on the occasion of Arturo examining the so-so new output of Sleater-Kinney, I'm inspired to enter my parallel vault here. And I'm extracting a great example of what female rock and roll rage and Spitfire is supposed to sound like at its very best. Now, of course, Sleater-Kinney is an innovator of that model, but like we just said, those years have passed. So, in that case, let us celebrate Amyl and the Sniffers instead. This Australian punk band's 2019 self-titled debut album is one of my favorites of the past 5 years. Arturo and I were inspired by this record enough to dedicate an entire Parallel Universe segment to the band's great follow-up album, Comfort to Me, 2+ years ago. Now, one can make the argument that that album is better and more mature than the debut, but I'm sticking with this self-titled debut as my Amyl drug of choice.
Yep, me too.
Listening to it again this past week, I'm struck by how fresh and urgent it still sounds. It booms and bangs and thrusts and propels and bursts in barely controlled fits of attitude and nihilism. I mean, one of the best songs on this thing is called GFY, short naturally for Go Fuck Yourself. The messaging here is pretty darn unambiguous. Now, I suppose any foursome can pick up instruments and make a joyful noise in the same spirit, but these kids immediately showed that they were set apart and talented as hell. They're really, through the record, there are awesome crunchy guitar riffs, killer bass lines, crashing metronomic drums, and just enough diversity in the songwriting to keep things engaging and surprisingly smart. The agility of long album opener and long album closer, Starfire 500 and Some Mutts Can't Be Muzzled, are undeniable. And the fact that the songs in between are so short and simple adds considerable charm to the mix. But the star here absolutely positively is singer lyricist and singer and lyricist Amy Taylor. She is a screamer and a bitch on wheels of the grandest order. She is all attitude and whatever the female equivalent of virulent sexuality is. One of my favorite songs on the album, Control, on that song, Taylor yells unironically, "I like being a big bad wolf. I like telling people off." This lady is not playing a role here. She is what she is, and the rock and roll world is better off for it. Now, personally, I cannot wait to hear what Amyl and the Sniffers deliver to the world next. They're on the verge of being one of the best rock bands in the world, but it starts here with the 2019 debut. While they may grow more sophisticated and get objectively better, they will never release a statement quite as pronounced or as welcome as this one, I don't think. This is still just an amazing and exciting listen. Pretty sure you agree, Redder.
Oh yeah, I mean, when this album came out in 2019, I mean, seriously, they're like, oh man, it's hard for me to come up with the words to describe how excited I was when this album came out because it was pure, unabashed, kick you in the ass, take no prisoners, rock and roll.
Yep.
And I mean, in the last, maybe not the decade, but the last half decade, the best rock and roll has really come from Australia.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
this band's in the forefront of that. And yeah, it's just pure. There's something pure about them. There's no there are no affectations. This is who they are. They are who they are. And it comes through in their music. It cuts through so much bullshit. They're the purest punky rock and roll band. Fuck indie. They're just rock and roll band.
Yeah,
Pure
absolutely.
punk, pure punk rock and roll. And a lot of the people who don't like them are, the typical pretentious indie hipster douchebags, who
Yep.
like their music to be oh so polite. Oh, we have to be
Yeah.
polite all the time. Fuck that. Rock
So
and roll is not supposed to be polite. Come on, fuck
So
off.
coincidentally, if folks, if you've been listening to this podcast for the past 2 months, I think Arturo's got a trademark pending for indie hipster douchebag
Yes.
with the USPTO. So he's going to be the proud owner. So coming to a T-shirt near you,
Yeah.
it's going to say, "I'm not a hipster, indie hipster douchebag."
Listen,
Yeah, go ahead.
look at the trajectory from the first album, this one that we're talking about, to the second one. Amyl and the Sniffers, self-titled debuted at number 22 in the Australian charts.
Yep.
By the time Comfort to Me came out in 2021, it went to number 2 in Australia,
Mhm.
number 21 in the UK. Okay. And I'm looking here at a chart that says US sales, top album sales. It actually went really high. It went as far as like very, very briefly went to 18 and then dripped
Wow.
down after that. So like this band really, from one album to the next, really made some headway, which
Yeah.
means that they developed a following.
Yes,
They
and
developed
there might be a star turn coming.
there might be, yeah. Now you say, well, 2021, we're now in 2024. What happened? Well, 2021 was still pandemic time. What happened in 2022? They spent a lot of that year touring, making money.
Yes.
They
Yeah,
had to
that
make
which is a
money.
good thing to do.
Yeah,
Yeah.
they needed to make some money, and they opened for Weezer, Fall Out Boy, and Green Day, especially on the European leg of that Hella Mega tour. And then last year, who do they open for? They opened for Smashing Pumpkins. They opened for Jane's Addiction. Those are some pretty heavyweight bands to be
Yeah, I
opening
was
up.
going to say that must have been a fun show. I mean,
Yeah,
especially Amyl and Smashing Pumpkins must have been a really fun show.
yeah. And Amyl probably blew Billy Corgan off the stage.
Well, yeah, I mean, at this
Yeah.
point, yeah, I mean, it's not hard to do.
Yeah.
Uh,
So, but so yeah, no, their new album We're still waiting for it, but hey, they're still making their money and recouping off of COVID, and they have their fans, man. They have a
Yes,
big
they
fan
do.
base. I'm looking
And
forward to their next album whenever it comes out.
and if I can give a brief four-word review of this band that I think says it all: AC/DC with a vagina. Chris here again. Arturo and I have differing feelings about the subscription streaming service Spotify. While he likes to rail against the algorithmic component, I like the ability to find and then manage a personal catalog of music. The program is especially great for assembling playlists. Well, guess what? We've assembled a playlist to accompany this episode. The playlist features a healthy mix of all the music we describe and analyze during the episode. Think of it as a soundtrack to your curmudgeonly life. Find the link in this episode's description. And also become a member of our curmudgeonly community on Facebook if you haven't done so already. Let's now return to our regularly scheduled programming.
So, any discussion or talk about 1968 in rock has to begin with the biggest band of the time, and that is the Beatles. And they're arguably, not to me really, but arguably their most controversial album, and that is the legendary self-titled album, otherwise known as the White Album. We're talking about the second golden age of rock. We're now in the year 1968, and we're talking about the band of the era, the Beatles. Chris?
Yeah, not so sure that it's more controversial than Let It Be, but it certainly is controversial, and so that's a good call. So yes, let's talk about the self-titled record, The Beatles, otherwise colloquially known as the White Album, which came out in 1968. So the Magical Mystery Tour of 1967 proved to be short-lived and as an era for the Beatles. Reality smacked that cosmic period back down to earth in 68. You might say that the band had a lousy 1968 for sure, with only their self-titled album of that year as its saving grace. But
How can it be lousy if Hey Jude came out?
Well, yeah, well, that's what I'm saying. But I mean, you figured that their self-titled record and Hey Jude Revolution as the saving grace. But man, what a spectacular saving grace it was, as the White Album, as I've said, as it's colloquially known, the White Album is regarded as one of the band's very best records, and in the view of some, including my partner here, their very best. More on that in a bit. But the album came during a period of considerable unrest for the band. Their manager, Brian Epstein, had died of an accidental drug overdose in August of 1967, leaving an absolutely broad, gaping hole in the band's leadership and business acumen that eventually proved fatal. Paul McCartney's attempts to fill that leadership void, both musically and financially, were met with derision and open disdain by his bandmates, and efforts to get the band's label and associated media company Apple off the ground flailed. John Lennon, meanwhile, rejected the band's association with the Maharishi Yogi, even as George Harrison embraced it whole hog. The energy grew so bad at one point that Ringo Starr, drummer, actually quit the band for several weeks during the making of the White Album and had to be recruited back with hopefully no hard feelings. Who knows? So there was fracture, there was fissure, there was violent creative tension, and it all had the unintended but wonderful consequence of bringing out the best in each of these bandmates. The White Album is the sound of Paul, John, George, and even Ringo declaring musical independence and adulthood over the span of two albums, or two discs, even as they continue to mostly accompany each other on these songs. Paul traveled in two really distinct directions here. He became a foremost crafter of silly story songs, with standouts including Obli Dee, Obla Da, and Rocky Raccoon.
Obla Dee, Obla Da.
That's what I tried to say. Obla Dee, Obla Da. Jeez. You're the one that supposedly has been drinking before we came on the air. Jeez. And he also became a banger of rip rock and sing-alongs such as Back in the USSR, Birthday, and the especially gnarly Helter Skelter. Wink, wink, hint, hint, Charlie Manson. Funny line here from Rob Sheffield's wonderful book, Dreaming the Beatles. Quote, you listen to Obla Di Obla Da, a lighthearted ode to family life beloved by children of all ages, and you're hearing John beat on the piano, pretending that it's Paul's skull. End quote. Now, John, in a maturation phase, started to get in touch with his hurt inner child, delivering the beautiful ballad and dedicated to his mother, Julia, the intense Maharishi toss-off, Sexy Sadie, and the appropriately weary-sounding I'm So Tired. He also explored mysticism and the avant-garde on songs like Dear Prudence, Glass Onion, and the Yoko Ono collaboration Revolution Number 9, a noise collage that scared the shit out of me the first time I heard it as a 15-year-old kid. Now, I'm usually predisposed to say that most Beatle albums are Paul albums. I would say that the White Album is pretty clearly a John record overall. George Harrison leapt forward stunningly as a songwriter and found a distinctly melodic voice, recruiting his friend Eric Clapton to shred accordingly on While My Guitar Gently Weeps. There was the amusingly contemptuous Piggies and the horn-spiked rocker Savoy Truffle. And Ringo even got a star turn here on the first song he wrote to make a Beatles record, the mid-tempo thumper Don't Pass Me By. The diversity, the dizzying flow, and relentless pace of these songs was absolutely stunning. The White Album simultaneously blew up the notion of a unified band while somehow creating a unified whole. Neat trick. Rob Sheffield will get my last words here. Quote, more than any other Beatles music, the White Album feels like a map tracing the points from boyhood to manhood. It has kiddie sing-songs, teenage lust, adult breakdowns of sex, death, destruction, religion, insomnia, and despair, ending with Ringo crooning a schmaltzy old Hollywood lullaby. It's grown men trying to speak the lost language of children. Yet for all the rancor, you can hear all four tap into that old team spirit. As John said, quote, Dylan broke his neck and we went to India. Everybody did their bit. And now we're all just coming out of a shell in a new way of kind of saying, remember what it was like to play. Quote, end quote, end quote. Arturo, I'm sure you have a hell of a lot to say about this album, which I know you love.
Oh boy. All right. Well, on this podcast, we have spoken at length about the bullshit myth surrounding double albums, that they are usually bloated and indulgent and should all be edited to single length. You can, and I have in our best of 2022 episode, when I talked about Big Thief's brilliant album, double album, Dragon, New Moon Mountain, I Believe in You. You can make a long, comprehensive list of double albums throughout music history that prove that double albums are, for the most part, that they range from good to great, and they are usually either among an artist's best work or they are their best work. Nevermore has this been truer than when regarding the Beatles' self-titled album, forever known as the White Album. As a Beatles fan, it enrages me whenever I hear or read people go on about how this record should have been edited to a single album. It is absolute ignorant nonsense from people whose collective musical taste is either up their ass, their collective ass, or people who aren't open-minded or even astute enough to understand what the White Album really is and what it really stands for. Detractors of this masterpiece tend to think or say that it's a hodgepodge. It's a slapdash collection of songs by John, Paul, and George that amount to nothing more than 3 or 4, if you want to count Ringo, solo albums put together. Wrong on so many levels. What people have to understand and sometimes fail to understand is that while the recording of the White Album in the studio was fractious and fraught with arguments, bickering, and infighting, the composing of these songs came at a time when the band were still a cohesive, unified front. Most of the material was written when they were doing their, as you alluded to, Chris, their spiritual retreats with the Maharishi Yogi in India. After they returned to England, they workshopped and demoed the songs in one of George Harrison's homes. You can hear all these demos on YouTube if you want to, and any combination of words you want to put up there. It was the sound of a band still together, still sharp, still in peak form, and still firing on all cylinders. And then you have the form, structure, and thematic content of the album itself. No, it is not indulgent in coherent hogwash. The White Album, from start to finish, is a musically, aesthetically, thematically, and lyrically coherent and cohesive record that stands as one of the greatest artistic statements of any art form of the 20th century. From the very beginning, the band set out to make a record that was the polar opposite of Sgt. Pepper's in every way. What is Sgt. Pepper's aesthetically? Color and unity. What is the White Album? Monochromatic, white and black, no color. Also, it is fractured and fragmented, almost uncomfortably skewed. People who take issue with the haphazard shape of the music just don't understand the fractured and how would I say it? You know, they just don't get the fractured, fragmented feel of the album, and that it is the whole point of the freaking album, musically and visually. Especially if you open the gatefold cover of the original LP, it reinforces that notion. Now, why would they do that? That brings us to the lyrical themes of the White Album. Sgt. Pepper's was all about togetherness and finding beauty and comfort either within yourself or outside of yourself, while also looking to bridge a generation gap. The White Album finds the Beatles taking a more cynical tone. From one song to another, the recurring theme is satire, actually enforcing the generation gap, and more specifically, satirizing conventional, conservative, quote unquote, straight society, which is becoming more fractured and fragmented as the Beatles saw it in 1968. Paul McCartney, while an avowed Beach Boys fan, cannot help but take a friendly jab at them with the spoof back in the USSR. Rocky Raccoon sees McCartney satirize the traditional tropes of Hollywood westerns. Why Don't We Do It on the Road? In the Road, sorry, finds McCartney going to full-on sex rock mode while also taking a friendly shot at blues stereotypes. His attempt at trying to match the heaviness of The Who on Helter Skelter also manages to rollickingly spoof, and it is a rollicking spoof, of the heavy direction that rock music in general was going in at that time. George Harrison's Piggies is hated by a lot of people, but it perfectly fits the overall theme of the album with its vicious portrayal of the gluttony and greed of the middle and upper classes. This attack shows itself again on disc 2 with Harrison's Savoy Truffle. No, folks, it is not just about Harrison's love of sweet pastries. He was blossoming as a songwriter at this point and becoming an underrated lyricist, providing a subtle commentary on gluttony and greed by putting a version of himself up front and center. And of course, there's John Lennon, whose songwriting and singing on this record are a tour de force. The continuing story of Bungalow Bill with its sing-along chorus is one of the most poignant songs on the whole album, taking on the ethical issues of big game hunting among the aristocracy and daring to ask what kind of example this sets for children. The rollicking Glass Onion seems to satirize the whole Beatle myth. Your Blues is his counterpoint to McCartney's Why Don't We Do It in the Road, a song that spoofs the blues while also bathing and glorifying in its sweaty, heated intensity. Sexy Sadie is Lennon's scathing attack on his perceived hypocrisy of the Maharishi Yogi's supposed holiness, serving as a rebuttal to the whole flower power movement's seeming obsession with spiritual enlightenment. Even the most controversial song on the album, Revolution 9, works in the broader context of what this album is about. Now, calling it a terrible song, like a lot of people on social media do, is actually an inaccurate disservice.
And
It
it's an
is
insult.
not, it's not a song. It's not a song at all.
Yeah.
It's an experimental sound collage. By calling it Revolution 9, Lennon actually tips his hat as to what the piece of music, or whatever you want to call it, is actually about. In both Revolution 1, the acoustic bluesy version, and Revolution, the rocking B-side to Hey Jude, Lennon confronts the turbulent political mood of the time again, a fractured, fragmented society. With the unsettling sounds and noise effects, Lennon is evoking the feeling and the utter dread of what a revolution would actually feel and sound like. The genius stroke is when this track, toward the end of the album, is juxtaposed with the very last song on the album, Good Night, another Lennon number, this time sung by Ringo Starr. Originally written as an acoustic lullaby for Lennon's son Julian and offered to Frank Sinatra, in the Beatles' hands, it's another glorious piece of satire, this time of the heavily orchestrated, string-laden, sentimental, mushy popular music of the previous generation. Putting it immediately after the atonal dread of Revolution 9, it's the Beatles' attempt to comfort the listener after the full-on assault of the previous track, while at the same time serving one last dash of cheeky middle fingering to the conventional straight society the band are increasingly antagonistic toward.
Yeah, that's a good call. I mean, it's basically it's it's going to be all right.
Yeah,
is basically what that's all about. So that's pretty cool. Good call.
Yeah. Even the songs that are not overtly aligned with the overall satiric theme of the album make sense in their inclusion when one takes a step back and looks at them with a keen critical eye. Lennon supposedly hated Obla Di Obla Da, but the supposed romantic utopia of the characters in McCartney's attempt at happy-go-lucky ska is thrown off a bit by the wistful, almost sighing sad of resignation at the life goes on part of the chorus, implying that this happiness is bound to end. Harrison's While My Guitar Gently Weeps mourns the lack of love and compassion in a world gone wrong. Again, fractured, fragmented society. Things are fucked up. Lennon's I'm So Tired reflects that same frustration with world weariness. McCartney's Birthday, on the surface, seems like typical McCartney-esque whimsical bullshit, but in the context of the record can be seen as a condemnation of conventional society's shallowness and inherent silliness. While Lennon's Everybody's Got Something to Hide Except Me and My Monkey seems like crappy surrealist humor, but is actually Lennon, perhaps being a bit self-righteous, taking a shot at the dishonesty and untrustworthiness of straight society. Cry Baby Cry, another Lennon classic, takes the sadness of the harsh generation gap in McCartney's She's Leaving Home from Sgt. Pepper's and takes it to the next evolutionary step, another sad resignation of misunderstanding and differences that will never be reconciled. Another symptom of a fractured, fragmented society. McCartney's lovely Blackbird isn't just about a bird striving to be free. In McCartney's own words, although in later years he does exhibit a tendency to change his story from time to time from one interview to another, it is an allegory for the civil rights movement, another result of a fractured, fragmented society. Lennon's gorgeous Dear Prudence, an evocation of and an invitation to pure, no strings attached love and self-actualization, doesn't show social satire on its own. But when placed in the track listing between the Beach Boys spoof Back in the USSR and the self-immolation of Glass Onion, it offers a glimpse of hope and the chance for love and wonder in, yes, again, a fractured, fragmented society gone wrong. Even Lennon's Julia, obviously an acoustic ode to his deceased mother, works in the album's context. It's looking to the comfort and love of a mother in the midst of a world going increasingly wrong. I can go on and on. This is not only my favorite Beatles album, it is, in my not so humble opinion, hands down their greatest album, where even the very few quote unquote bad tracks work and fit in the greater whole. It is also, in my not so humble opinion, on a short list of candidates for the claim as the greatest album ever made of all time. Chris?
Yeah, I mean that was a pretty sterling defense of the record. I would still put Abbey Road and Revolver at least those two ahead of it.
Bullshit.
I
Abbey
think
Road, overrated. Revolver, great. Slightly overrated.
yeah, for what it's worth, Abbey Road is now the highest charting album on the greatest albums of all time list for Rolling Stone. I believe it came in at like number 4 or number 5.
Number
Five.
five.
Yeah, something pretty high. So that's interesting to know. And so I mean, I just think that just in terms of a feat of engineering and a feat of just sort of deft joy, as in deft, not Def Jam, deft
Yeah.
joy
Yeah.
as a symbol of that. I think it's great, and I think and Revolver obviously because of the way it just blows up the world and just sort of reinvents everything is absolutely astonishing. But I mean, I think the White Album is right there. I mean, again, it's such an engaging listen. You're right that it's what a 29 song record. I want to say it's 29 songs,
The
and
White Album has an overall lyrical theme. Abbey Road doesn't.
yeah. Oh, and I know. I mean, there is a theme, but there's also it never there's not a wasted note over the
Yeah.
course of 30 songs. There's no wasted
Even
note.
what quote unquote sucks works in the context.
Yeah, absolutely. And it you have these fun notes and everything is well placed. It's one of the most perfect sequencing jobs
Yeah.
in the history of rock and roll. That is for sure. And again, like I said, it's just like this they were a fractured band, but they somehow pulled off the miracle of making possibly their most unified record.
Yeah.
Even though they couldn't stand each other in the course of making it, they managed to come up with a really unified statement, a collective statement. So again, it's one of rock's great paradoxical accomplishments in that sense. And so yeah, we just wrote ourselves a treatise on the White Album. Good stuff, brother. Good stuff.
Thank you.
And so from there, so as we've done in these second golden age of rock episodes that we've done for each year, we seem to start with the Beatles and then come with oh yeah, and then the Beatles. You can't talk about the Beatles without talking about the Rolling Stones. Well, here in 1968, in terms of being album artists and also serious artistes, the Rolling Stones officially catch up and then some with the release of Beggars Banquet. Arturo, tell us about Beggar's Banquet and the follow-up to their Satanic Majesty's Request from the year before.
Yeah. Towards the end of 1967, the Rolling Stones were seen as the number one contenders for the Beatles' World Heavyweight Championship title. When their psychedelic opus, their Satanic Majesty's Request, became a critical and commercial failure, they were seen by some as finished, as a washed-up band with nothing left to offer. Two things happened that changed the band's fortunes and musical direction, and they both had to do with Keith Richards. First, during the Stones' many tours of the US from 1964 through 66, Richards bought a ton of old blues, folk, and country records of the old vintage American variety. Due to the constant touring and busy schedule, not to mention the craziness that enveloped the band throughout 1967, Richards never got a chance to fully listen to his purchases. As 1968 came around and with no touring commitments, Richards got that chance and rekindled his love affair with the blues as well as with other kinds of American roots music. This love affair would point the way toward the sound he wanted to take his band in. Second, there was his discovery of open tuning for his guitar, something he learned from listening to said old blues albums, applying the technique to rock and roll and some pretty nifty and original recording techniques. It gave the Stones a new, exciting, and innovative sound, first heard on the classic cymbal Jumpin' Jack Flash, released in May 1968, a worldwide hit. To hear Richards himself describe the sound, quote, I used a Gibson Hummingbird acoustic tuned to open D, 6-string, open D to open E, which is the same thing, same intervals, but it would be slackened down some for D. Then there was a capo on it to get that really tight sound. And there was another guitar over the top of that, but tuned to Nashville tuning. I learned that from somebody in George Jones's band in San Antonio in 1964.
Oh, to be a fly on the wall in that room.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Two drunks in the same room. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
The high-strung guitar was an acoustic too. Both acoustics were put through a Philips cassette recorder. Just jam the mic right in the guitar and play it back through an extension speaker. End quote. The credit shouldn't go all to Richards, though. Mick Jagger was growing as a more sophisticated and underratedly intelligent lyricist. He joined Richards' wavelength in going back to kick-ass, roots-based rock and roll. According to him, the song came, quote, out of all the acid of satanic majesties. It's about having a hard time and getting out, just a metaphor for getting out of all the acid things, end quote. Even Brian Jones, who was getting increasingly lost in his drug addiction fog at this time, said the song was, quote, getting back to the funky essential essence, end quote. Well, it worked. Not only did Jumpin' Jack Flash reintroduce the Rolling Stones as a badass rock and roll band, it revitalized the band's commercial fortunes. It was a worldwide top 10 hit, going to #1 in both the US and the UK. This, of course, was just a primer for what would come next, and that would be the first album of the Stones' Imperial phase and one of the greatest album streaks in rock history. When Beggars Banquet came out in December 1968, it shocked critics and fans with its down and dirty evocation of grimy blues rock and rough and tumble authentic folk and country rock. Of course, the general tone of the album isn't what listeners are confronted with when track 1 starts out. Sympathy for the Devil is a candidate for the greatest Stones song ever, with its Latin rhythms, Bill Wyman's slinky bass lines that were later ripped off by Iggy Pop in Lust for Life, and Keith Richards' staccato guitars driving the track into an intense polyrhythmic orgy. Jagger's sly lyrics, based on Mikhail Bulgakov's novel, The Master and Margarita, show him writing in character as Satan and taking credit for much of the world's evils. And it shows Mick at his most defiantly sinister and sinisterly clever. Dear Doctor, Prodigal Son, and the subterranean sludge of Parachute Woman shows how fluent the Stones had become at recreating authentic blues, probably the best white band in history to ever do it.
Yeah.
Factory Girl is the first shot of Keith Richards' obsession with country and gets it sublimely right. The mournful ballad No Expectations has some exquisite slide guitar work by Brian Jones and serves as his last great contribution to the band. The sleazy, sordid tale of having a threesome with a 16-year-old girl and her mother is the narrative that drives Stray Cat Blues, one of the funkiest full-throttle blues rock bruisers in the Stones' entire catalog, and makes you want to get nasty.
Oh yeah.
It exemplifies Charlie Watts's drumming genius for utilizing his jazz chops to stay just one step behind the beat, and Richards' riff as well, giving the track its offbeat, slightly off-kilter, slack rhythm. The album ends with the band's first foray into epic anthemic gospel with Salt of the Earth, proof that even this band of hedonistic degenerates can make Jesus music sound cool.
Yep.
Throughout the decade of the 1960s, the Rolling Stones always managed to release singles that rivaled some of the Beatles' best singles. With Beggars Banquet, they finally matched the Beatles as an albums band. They would surpass them the following year, but that's another story. Chris?
Yes, it is. I can just imagine when this album comes out late in '68. I could just imagine it must have been a real shock to the system, to
Yeah.
people who were paying attention, for them to go from, a few great singles here and there, and then that what was seen as a misfire at the time in their Satanic Majesty's request, to go from that to this absolute masterpiece,
Yeah.
must have been really, really just not even just striking, but shocking.
Yeah. Yeah.
We have to note that this is where they made the transition from Andrew Luke Oldham
Yeah.
as their producer to Jimmy Miller. Jimmy Miller was an actual musician. Luke Oldham, as a producer, he was a good engineer, or a competent. He was a competent engineer, but as a producer, not there. So Jimmy Miller was like he actually was a guy who like lived the blues and lived roots music, and it really, really shows in just how well arranged, orchestrated, recorded, and just how alive everything sounds. Starting from this record, he manned the boards for I believe it was 5 straight records, starting on this one, and really, really just makes a huge difference. And just the leap in sophistication, I don't think anybody could have expected them to come up with stuff like Stray Cat Blues and Factory Girl.
Or Sympathy for the Devil.
Or Sympathy for the Devil. But, based on what had come before it, even though they, I mean, Jumping Jack Flash is a great single. And they also had Honky Tonk Woman, which, I think might actually have been the B-side of Jumping Jack, but was really great.
It was not. It was Children of the Moon.
Okay, gotcha. And then, but even stuff like Ruby Tuesday and stuff like that from the couple years before, Paint It Black. I mean, they had great singles in them, but I don't think that going from that to these sort of deep cuts that really embody the spirit of country music and of blues, and like you said, the ingenious drumming of Charlie Watts, not just on that song, but a couple of others like A Street Fighting Man too, where he kind of brings up his jazz chops to go with that that sort of American vernacular music. It's just really astonishing. And here's the thing, Beggars Banquet, we're focusing on it. I'm listening to that record in preparation for this episode this week. And if you rank Beggars Banquet, Let It Bleed from '69, Sticky Fingers from '71, and Exile on Main Street from '72, Beggars Banquet is fourth. In my mind.
That tells you how great that streak was.
Yeah, that's what I mean. And so I think Beggars Banquet gets a little bit lost for it being as brilliant as it is because it's in the shadow of those other 3 albums.
Yeah.
And so yeah, definitely, folks, check out Beggars Banquet and just marvel at, again, its sophistication, its the expanse of its vocabulary and understanding of American musical forms of the 20th century. And just
no white band did it better.
No white band did it better
to this day.
Yeah, and it also speaks to the genius of, Keith Richards he's caricatured as, being, how is that guy still alive, and being the druggie and being the basis for the Jack Sparrow character in the Pirates of the Caribbean movies. But that guy was a genius. Yeah. And what Artie just described in terms of his engineering chops and how he got the sound that he did for much of this record. Richards deserves his props as a true rock and roll genius, and one of the foremost of all time. And so he take him seriously, folks, and take this band seriously. Take this album seriously. Great stuff.
On this episode, we continued our second golden age of rock series by analyzing the year 1968. For the next episode, we are moving to the first decade of the 21st century to talk about a band that is near and dear to our hearts. It was a very fertile decade for rock music as bands like the White Stripes, the Strokes, LCD Sound System, Kings of Leon, and Arctic Monkeys got all kinds of critical and commercial acclaim. But one band flew under the radar during this time and had a staggeringly brilliant 5-album run from 2001 to 2010 that not only ranks among some of the best rock music of this decade, but also arguably surpasses the output of some of the bands I just mentioned. The name of this group is Black Rebel Motorcycle Club. Join us next time as the Curmudgeon Rock Report brings you the most underrated band of the noughties, or the aughts, whatever you want to call it. All right, next, Chris, you're going to tackle a Russian novel length of albums here, but they all deserve to be put in the same segment. I don't know how I can add to this one, but yeah, dude, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, kind of building off the theme that that Arturo talked about a little bit before, and you'll notice that in '68, we named our 1967 episode of this second Golden Age of series. We subtitled it "Arrivals in Technicolor" because everything was loud, it was boisterous, it was explosive, it was kaleidoscopic, it was psychedelic, it was pastel. In '68, what you found is that things started to dial back. I mean, I think there was a high point, and folks were looking to get past that or to restore. And so what you ended up with was more monochromatic. And if there was color, it was warm, rustic hues. It was rolling hills.
The beginning of the beginning of the Guys in the Woods.
Yeah,
that
absolutely.
streak of album covers in rock, starting from the late 60s to the early to mid 70s, when anything that was slightly rustic and acoustic and folk rocky, it's always People in the Woods. That's
yes, absolutely. Which actually the epitome of it was the first one, which was John Wesley Harding by Dylan in late '67.
Dylan with a bunch of Native Americans in the woods.
He's in the woods with Indians. Yeah, it doesn't get more doesn't get rootsier than that, folks. For sure. So what we have here is we have this indicative movement of bands wanting to get back to the roots of American and British vernacular music. And so we have three bands and albums that we're going to focus on. One American, one mostly Canadian, and one British. And you're talking about bringing cultural heritage into the forefront to really, innovating by bringing things to the past and splicing that, from the past and really splicing them with that contemporary '68 rock and roll ethic. And so you end up with three tremendous albums, namely the Byrds' Sweetheart of the Rodeo, the band's Music from Big Pink, and the Kinks. The Kinks are the Village Green Preservation Society. Which are just all tremendous records. I'm going to do them one by one, taking them in the order that they were released in '68. So we're going to start with the band's Music from Big Pink. Hey, not bad for Bob Dylan's backup band, right?
Yeah, yeah.
So
innovative,
yes,
so innovative and original, even when they're going back to the roots.
Yes. So yes, the band famously accompanied Dylan on a tour of the UK in 1966. But a band of this magnitude was due for its own star turn, even after spending a chunk of 1967 recording with and for Dylan in upstate New York. Much of the result of those recording sessions, conducted at a rented house affectionately known as Big Pink, found the light of day years later with the release of the Basement tapes, I believe, in 1975. Not all the revelations were reserved for Dylan, however. It was during that time that the band started to find its own footing writing its own songs. Those originals, along with three Dylan co-compositions, comprised the band's debut album, Music from Big Pink, recorded months later in New York and released in July of 1968. Now, how to describe the music of the band? I think a good way to do it is to deem it a soulful hybrid of rhythm and blues, folk, and country music. It was American vernacular music as crafted by four Canadian dudes and a rascal from Arkansas. The band's recorded output was light on overdubs. It was light on overdubs, and it was also light on pretension, telling throwback stories and expressing nakedly raw sentiments as if they were the norm rather than the exception. And make no mistake, what the band accomplished was an exception in a pop world dominated by psychedelic slop and schmaltzy pop in 1968. One thing to point out about music from Big Pink is its balance. That's immediately apparent. Guitarist Robbie Robertson became the primary songwriter on subsequent albums, but here contributed just four songs, including most famously The Wait, which at right now is at 329 million plus plays and counting on Spotify. But he also contributes the weird and wild Chest Fever, which is defined by Garth Hudson's devilish church organ playing and also features one of the best song names in rock history. Yeah, Chest Fever, baby, Chest Fever.
I think of Chest Rockwell from Boogie Nights.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good call. So anyway, now Robertson's bandmate Richard Manuel offers three songs of his own, including the gorgeous ballad Lonesome Susie. Now, Dylan, naturally, as I said, has three songwriting credits, including co-writes with Manuel on album opener Tears of Rage and with bassist Rick Danko on the rousing This Wheel's on Fire. Now, Dylan's lone solo credit, which is debatable, actually, Bert's the debut album's best song, the unbelievably transcendent white boy gospel of I Shall Be Released, defined by Manuel's soaring, cracked falsetto vocal performance. Seriously, this has one of the most unbelievable lyrics in the history of rock and roll. When he starts talking about where he sees the light shining down from the west on down to the east. Well, if anybody knows anything about the Old Testament, when they talk about God and his winds and his ruach, the spirit, it always travels from east to west. So now, if he's getting his self-revelation from the west down to the east, that means he's been heading in the wrong direction. And so now this is coming to see the light and getting over that wall that's too high for him to see on the second verse. And so Dylan, for a Jew, what a great gospel writer. He's one of the foremost like bearable gospel writers in rock ever, and that's just testament to that. So music from Big Pink enjoyed modest success, peaking at number 30 on the Billboard 200 albums chart. The Wait also reached number 63 on the Billboard Hot 100 singles chart. That was a harbinger of greater success to come on the next year's self-titled masterpiece. At some point, some pop music encyclopedias dubbed the band's blend of styles as Americana, which to me trivialized what these guys actually were able to do. A better descriptor for the band's thing may actually just be America, as the country's musical stylings of the previous 100 years is really what the band captured. They may have been rock's grandest traditionalists, no varnish, no polish, just their instruments, an expansive music vocabulary, and buckets full of sincerity. The world was a better place for it. Arturo, your thoughts on this album?
Did you know that the album cover for the band's music from Big Pink was actually was a painting by Bob Dylan himself?
Oh, no fooling. Yeah. That interesting trivia.
No tidbit there.
Yeah, gotcha. So any thoughts on the album itself?
Oh, dude, yeah. I mean, you nailed it. Listen, I personally am a fan of their version of the old traditional long black veil.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
That Johnny Cash covered, but I think the band's version is the best version of that song. Is it with Rick Danko, the bass player, his vocals?
Yeah.
People talk about Manuel's vocals and
Levon
Helm's vocals.
Danko is the best singer in that band.
Danko was just as emotive as a singer as any of them. Yeah. And their version of Long Black Veil to me is the definitive version.
Yeah, it's certainly my favorite version, and because the arrangement kind of borders on
Yeah.
because the it borders on soul, almost like
Right.
Staxy type soul,
Yeah.
as opposed to this sort of made for big voiced singers ballad, which is
Yeah.
in most of the versions, like the Carter family had a
Right.
version of it that
Right.
uh, like Johnny Cash's in-laws had a
Yeah.
version of it that
Yeah.
plays just very straight, whereas this one is definitely more rousing and just kind of
Right.
showed the spirit. That band was long on spirit.
Yep.
They were short on bullshit, and long on spirit, and
Yeah.
that's why we need to honor them. Speaking of honoring American musical tradition, let's move on to the next of these albums, The Byrds' "Sweetheart of the Rodeo." Now, in 1968, the Byrds went from being 8 miles high along a psychedelic highway to 8 miles down a long, out in the country dirt road. Pedal steel guitars took the place of Roger McGuinn's 12-string Rickenbacker. Indeed, the Byrds adopted a lot of country music to go with a little bit of rock and roll on Sweetheart of the Rodeo, its groundbreaking 1968 album released in August, sometimes referred to as the first country rock record, although that's debatable.
Right.
Uh, this is what happens when you invite a young, rambunctious singer-songwriter named Graham Parsons to join your band. Byrds mainstays Roger McGuinn and Chris Hillman were in need of two new bandmates entering 1968, having just fired David Crosby and Michael Clarke. They auditioned and hired Parsons ostensibly with him as a pianist in mind. Parsons, though, was too ambitious to merely toe the line. He came to the band in a full-blown country and western phase and soon pushed for the Byrds to adopt it for its own purposes. This meant cornball traditionalism along with the rebel-born living it out fare. Initially skeptical, McGuinn eventually relented and Sweetheart of the Rodeo was born. Now, ironically, Parsons was gone from the Byrds by the time the album hit the record store shelves in August of 68. Legal issues with Parsons' old label and a power struggle with McGuinn, both of which prompted McGuinn to overdub Parsons' lead vocals on three of the Sweetheart of the Rodeo songs. There is some debate whether that was legal or whether that was just McGuinn fucking with Parsons.
Yeah.
That ensured that all of that ensured that Parsons' tenure would be short-lived. Parsons was kind of a wild child, and at some
Right.
point along there, the Byrds get over to England. Parsons hooks up with Jagger and especially Keith Richards, and he joins that party, and there went the Byrds.
Yeah.
But no matter what Parsons left behind was a stone cold masterpiece of an album, probably one of the 200 best ever made. The manner in which the Byrds spliced their previous energy, purpose, and gift for arrangement with their newfound country leanings was absolutely stunning. This was especially apparent on the album's two requisite Bob Dylan covers. The Byrds, if you didn't know, covered a shitload of Dylan songs. You Ain't Going Nowhere and Nothing Was Delivered. And on two Parsons originals, the heart-achingly rendered Hickory Wind and my personal favorite, and I think the best song on the record, the rollicking 100 Years From Now,
Yeah.
which is weird because it's a Graham Parsons original, but the vocals are done by McGuinn and Hillman.
Mm.
It's harmony vocals from the two other guys, even though it's Parsons' best contribution to the Byrds by far. It was also evident this newfound country leaning and that this mastery was also evident in the band's bold choice of cover tunes, which ranged from the Louvin Brothers' hokey but pretty The Christian Life to Woody Guthrie's bluegrass-inflected Pretty Boy Floyd to Merle Haggard's honky-tonk classic Life in Prison.
Mm.
Sweetheart of the Rodeo flopped commercially, and the Byrds managed to hold on for 6 more records before disbanding, never again reaching these artistic heights. Parsons went on to become a country rock icon, taking what he helped thrust into the mainstream here and perfecting it, first along with Hillman in the Flying Burrito Brothers, and then has his own great Grievous Angel out there on the street doing his own thing. Did the Byrds actually invent country rock in recording Sweetheart of the Rodeo? That's really debatable, especially since Bob Dylan did a pretty good damn job of combining the genres on just John Wesley Harding the year before in 67. But the Byrds sure as hell perfected the formula on this album. It was a proto-punk statement of sorts, to abandon its tested and endorsed folk rock formula in favor of going cowpoke. But it worked then and it continues to work now. Sweetheart of the Rodeo remains an inspired listen. Arturo, what say you?
Yeah, calling this their artistic peak, man. After this, Roger McGuinn reformed the Byrds around the guitarist Clarence White. There are a lot of Clarence White fans out there, man. You
Yeah.
just piss them off.
Yeah,
But
I'm
anyway,
sure I did.
yeah. Do you know that aside from like when the Byrds went to England and Graham Parsons hooked up with Keith and actually it was Mick. Sorry, it was Keith. It was actually Keith and hooked up with them and left the Byrds. One of the sticking points was that the Byrds had a tour of South Africa
Yes.
planned
Yes.
during this time, and that was kind of like among like the more lefty political people in rock circles. That was kind of a taboo,
Yeah.
and Keith Richards is one of those who told Grant Parsons that, man, don't go to South Africa. Those guys are racists down there,
Yep.
and yeah, and that was a big reason for Parsons leaving the Byrds. And but when I think of this record, is how authentic their attempt at country really is, and their takes on it are really, really just is sincere. It's authentic. It's truer country than even a lot of the country that was coming out even at that time.
Yeah. I mean, the most astonishingly orthodox thing on it is the cover of I Am a Pilgrim,
Right.
which is a traditional tune. It's one of those standards that
Sure.
nobody knows who actually wrote it, but the way that they do it with there's the fiddle on there and just the acoustic strumming and then just the really earnest vocal from Roger
Mm,
McGuinn. It just
right.
astonishingly orthodox, and so they weren't faking it. They weren't saying, "Hey man, we're guys from LA doing country. We're cool." No, they were doing a country record.
Yeah.
And so the authenticity, like you said, the authenticity and the sincerity and the realism that they pumped into it, like even like nothing was delivered, they somehow managed to get a little bit of country boogie in that,
Right.
which it was hard to find up until John Wesley Harding. It was hard to find much country in
Sure.
Dylan. I mean, yeah, and granted, later on, I believe it was 68. Was it 68 or 69 that he did Nashville Skyline?
69.
It was 69. Okay.
Yeah.
So this is kind of a forerunner to that because a lot of people look at the at Nashville Skyline as being kind of a huge contribution or kind of an evolutionary step in country rock as well. I personally don't. I think that record is overrated. But anyway, the Byrds really hit it out of the park with this record. So that was the American vernacular accomplishment of
Going back to the
1968.
roots.
Going back to the roots. Now let's get to the British vernacular accomplishment,
Right.
arguably of 1968, and we're going to the Kinks, who at this point, I think, officially achieved sort of cult band status. With
Mhm.
the Kinks are the Village Green Preservation Society. That is the full name of this album, which again is another one of those that probably belongs in the top 200 albums of all time. It's my personal favorite Kinks record, so let's talk about it. The Kinks were the most English of all the British wave bands, though not necessarily by choice. The band, a lot of people don't realize this because it's kind of lost history. They were actually barred from touring in the US for 5 years, starting in 1965.
Yeah.
And that was the product of bad political dealings with the main American Musicians Union. Uh,
Mhm.
just Ray Davies kind of chalks that up to a combination of bad knowledge and bad behavior. Uh, so in other words, they were a little too droll at the wrong time and got themselves blackballed from the U.S. Well, that turned out to be a very good thing for the rock and roll canon, as it put Ray Davies in a position to turn his witty, satirical eye towards his countrymen and their mores, and also convey a certain reverence for tradition and what urbanization was helping to fade away there over in England. It's the latter theme there that Davies and his bandmates mine on The Kinks Are the Village Green Preservation Society, released in November 68, paying nostalgic tribute to a passing era and meditating on the very concept of memory in doing so. They get considerable mileage out of the influence of a photograph throughout the album, most notably on the incredible Baroque pop tune Picture Book. Seriously, one of the best and most ripped off
Yeah.
songs of all time. The guitar
Green
part of
Day ripped it off for
basically
Warning.
note for note.
Yeah.
But anyway, and they also get a lot of mileage out of that on the amusing album closer, which I love. People take pictures of each other.
To prove that they really existed.
Yes, very,
You
very.
cannot get a better lyric than that.
Yeah, yeah, it's pretty charming. It's like Davies at his best. His dry sense of humor was off the charts. So the band here, they employ music hall, folk, and blues to honor other crackling memories they bring to the forefront on the album. There's the chugging, pun intended, rhythms of Last of the Steam-Powered Trains. There's the lovely gentle sway of Sitting by the Riverside. There's the beautiful country tinged melody of Animal Farm. Seriously, that's another one of the best songs on the record. And then there's the aching longing of the harpsichord driven Village Green. It should be noted that there are two songs on this record. There's Village Green Preservation Society, which is the lead track, and then Village Green, which is a 2-minute lovely ballad, which actually dates back to 1966 and kind of birthed the concept then that they shelved until they recorded this record. Davies truly missed the simple people of that Village Green and hated those new American tourists, which he makes clear in the lyrics to Village Green. Now, Village Green Preservation Society cemented the Kings' status as a cult band. By this point, they weren't really selling records. They were a long way away from You Really Got Me. And something they enjoy in spades still today. Theirs was a fiercely intelligent, yet gorgeous cult that really inspired numerous bands that followed, most notably Blur in the 1990s, who did some incredibly kinkish records that stand among that decade's best volleys. Englishness was never cooler than it was in the hands of Ray and Dave Davies, and Englishness has never been as cool since. Arturo, what do you say?
Yeah, Ray Davies was a sociologist,
Yeah,
as
pretty
a
much.
lyricist. That guy really got into the minds, the collective mind of a populace, and the fears and the anxieties and the doubts and the love and the hatred and everything. And he really got into people's minds. I mean, he wrote the most brilliant character vignettes. They were short. A lot of his songs were character-driven short stories, and that told so much more of a story than just what the character was going through. It started with the character story, but it told a bigger story of the plight and the overall just existential dread of a society
Yep.
that was seeing their world disappear.
Yes.
We don't have a Ray Davies right now in our world in 2024. We really need that.
Yeah.
And it's we don't have that poetic voice in music or even in pop music. We don't have that.
Yeah. Well,
Everyone, we got to stay young forever. Ray Davies is like, no, dude, we're not going to be young forever. We're all going to die, and everything's
you have some. You have some pretty insightful people. I mean, you've got Adrienne Lenker is pretty good.
Yeah, but she's I love her, but she doesn't do that though. Especially on her last album, she's all tripped out and psychedelic in her lyrics.
Yeah, she's not really a chronicler, is she? I mean, so you have some folks, but there's nobody under 50 years old. Let's just put it this way that carries that mantle. I mean, most of these people are still alive, although recent photos of Ray Davies makes it look like he's pretty frail right now. He might be at his end. But you've got your people like Tweedy who's capable of it and folks, but nobody under 50 has the magic of the Ray Davies. And yeah, he was just like devastating because he could get like a pop song that was like basically he could make you rock out to like a real high concept joke, especially I think of late 70s and early 80s Kinks, especially the songs Low Budget and Come Dancing, which are two of the funniest songs of all time because nobody really
but they're also really sad. Those are some sad songs.
Yeah, they're sad, but they're funny but sad. because
Yeah.
and they get away with murder because they did routinely because they could get like people singing la 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 to stuff that could make them like cringe or to make them like be scared.
Yeah.
So just really really neat trick. So Ray Davies definitely worth celebrating. So Chris here again. We usually end our episodes by inviting you to join our Curmudgeonly community page on Facebook. Well, we're picking up our efforts there. Know people just as passionate as us about rock and roll? Invite them to join in the fun. You don't actually need our permission to do so. Also, expect to see a lot more content up there moving forward. Our mission is to engage you, so darn it, we'll engage you like a fire hose, or maybe like a firehouse if we're going to give love to Gene Simmons. We may also be making a few offers. Want to wear a t-shirt featuring our logo? You may have that opportunity soon. So be a fellow curmudgeon, help us expand our little community, and share your own musings via your own posts. We're at facebook.com/groups/curmudgeonrock. Continuing now with our run through 1968, there was another artist who, he's regarded as one of the great white soul singers of all time, and if he's a traditionalist, but kind of running counter to what we've been talking about, the monochromatic nature of 68, he decided to put in some pretty bright colors and shapes and sounds into his record in 1968, and in the process made one of the greatest albums ever made, probably top 50 of all time. Arturo, what are we talking about? Who are we talking about, and what are we talking about?
Yeah, before we discuss the music of Van Morrison's classic Astral Weeks album, the background story of how the album came about has to be discussed because it is just as interesting. In 1967, Van Morrison emerged from the ashes of Northern Irish garage rock band Them and put out the irresistible folk rock single Brown Eyed Girl, a worldwide top 10 hit. If you think you have not heard it, no, you have.
Yeah, you have.
It's one of the most enduringly timeless songs of not just the 1960s, but of the whole 20th century. That single, along with its rather hodgepodge odds and sods accompanying album, Blowin' Your Mind, came out on Bang Records, an indie label owned by Burt Burns, a guy with deep mafia and gangster connections. Remember that tidbit. It'll come up again soon. Morrison and Burns often clashed in regard to artistic direction, with Burns wanting Morrison to continue on the more commercial poppy direction of Brown Eyed Girl, while Morrison wanted to pursue a more esoteric path. This is indicative of the stubbornness and refusal to compromise that would go on to characterize much of Morrison's career later in the future. But anyway, Burns died of a heart attack in late December of 1967, and supposedly his widow, Eileen Burns, blamed the stress from the conflict her husband had with Morrison on his death. This, of course, is according to Morrison's then wife, Janet Rigsby, who went on record with this information in various interviews. As the widow, Mrs. Burns inherited all of Bang Records' contracts, and while Morrison immediately wanted out of the deal right after Burt Burns died, the widow refused to let him go, not only keeping him away from the recording studio, but also blocking him from performing at any New York City clubs, threatening many clubs with reprisals. Remember, they did have gangster connections. Morrison then moved with his wife to Boston and started playing at clubs in the Boston and Cambridge, Massachusetts areas. With a small band in an all-acoustic setting, he played a combination of both Them songs as well as songs from his Blowin' Your Mind album. However, he also started to play embryonic versions of the songs that would eventually appear on Astral Weeks. Word started to spread in music industry circles about the guy who did Brown Eyed Girl playing this new kind of folk music in clubs around Boston. Louis Merenstein, a producer and occasional A&R scout for Warner Brothers, was asked to check Morrison out. He was enthralled and entranced by what he heard and expressed keen interest in signing him. His business partner, Bob Schwade, who also worked for Warner's Publishing, started working to get Morrison out of his contract with Bang Records. Bang, and Eileen Burns in particular, were stubborn and wouldn't give Morrison up easily. The first condition for letting Morrison record for Warner Brothers was that Morrison had to write and submit to Web 4, Roman numeral 4, Music, the deceased Burt Burns' publishing company, 3 songs per month for the next year. Morrison agreed to it by going to the studio to record exactly 36 nonsensical gibberish songs in a single session and submitted them. The second condition was that Morrison had to give Web4 Music half of the publishing/copyright to any original song he would release as a single within 1 year from September 1968. Morrison and Warner Brothers dealt with this by not releasing any singles throughout this time, and none from the Astral Weeks album. The third and final condition was that Morrison had to include on his next album 2 songs that he had already recorded for Bang Records. These songs ended up being Madam George and Beside You, although the versions that appear on Astral Weeks are completely reworked versions of what are in the Bang catalog. Nevertheless, at one point, shortly before the release of Astral Weeks, Warner Brothers executive Joe Smith wanted to completely and totally take Morrison off Bang Records' hands and offered to buy out his contract. Remember what I said earlier about Bang Records and their mafia connections? Well, the famous comedian Don Rickles had a manager called Joe Scandori. Scandori was employed by Bang to be the intermediary in this exchange with Joe Smith. Scandori was notorious for being a very connected man, quote unquote. According to Smith, they met at an abandoned warehouse where Smith carried a bag with $20,000 in cash, and Scandori had 4 tall, heavily built men by his side. The exchange was made, and Smith quickly exited the building. When asked in a future interview if he would ever see these men again, Smith succinctly said, quote, "No, they were not in the music business," end quote. Now, what about the music on Astral Weeks? Frankly, back then and until now, it is an album that defies easy characterization. Is it folk music? Is it mystic Celtic music? Is it jazz? Is it jazz folk? Is it an utterly new subgenre of rock being born? Well, it is all of the above. It's also one of the most fascinating, awe-inspiring, deeply emotional, and perhaps even spiritual musical recordings of the 20th century. Acoustic guitars, cellos, flutes, brushing drums, and stand-up bass riffs sashay in and out of the mix in an intoxicating blend of songs of deeply impressionistic and stream of consciousness lyrics and image fragments, ruminating on youth, lost innocence, and a romantic yearning for something that's just beyond one's grasp. The title track goes straight for your gut with a soaring melody, a sloping lead guitar job and work, and vibrating cello that's nothing short of spellbinding. A weepy harpsichord, gliding flute, plaintive string section, and a plaintive string section combined to provide Cypress Avenue with an emotional counterpoint to Morrison's vocals and lyrics that evoke the innocence of youth in the most painfully romantic manner possible. And has there ever been a more lyrically elusive song that still resonates with unspeakable sadness and heartstring pulling than Madam George? Many people have claimed that it's about a broken-hearted drag queen, but Morrison himself in several interviews has refuted this, saying the character is a composite of 6 or 7 different people. Well, Morrison does sing at one point in the song, quote, "In the corner playing dominoes in drag, the one and only Madam George," end quote. Whatever. Anyway,
Yeah, I was gonna say.
the,
Yeah.
the song does contain several allusions to the city of Belfast itself, with Cypress Avenue itself mentioned along with the bridge that crosses the River Boyne and the deeply Protestant Sandy Row area of the city. All of this adds up to an abstract short film that Morrison is painting, as he does in all the songs on this album, of a romanticized vision of a world he wants to either live in or has lived in, and made all the more tragic by the fact that this ideal can never be attained. In the end, the lyrical details don't matter as much, really, as the emotional impact and wallop that the entire album contains. It's one of the most singular, affecting albums in the history of recorded music, an album that to this day casts a long shadow over so much of Van Morrison's incredibly prolific career. Chris?
Yeah, this has to be like just about the most geniusly arranged record in rock and roll history. I think just there's nothing else like it. They hit on a combination of instruments and tones and volumes and voices and just everything. It's just beautiful, and it's mysterious. It's a genuinely mysterious, haunting listen. And I will say this: I think you taught me this one time that if you want to do a green test with an album, do it with this one,
Yeah.
especially because the bass playing on this record is incredible.
Yeah.
I mean, some of the best, most subtle bass lines, especially on Sweet Thing. The bass line on Sweet Thing is just masterful, and it just shows how much of an artist Van Morrison really was. Because if you want to do a study and you contrast this record, 1968's Astral Weeks, with 1970's Moondance, because Moondance is one of the best straightforward soft pop rock records ever made.
Yeah.
That's another one of those top 200 records, and because it's got and it Stone Me and
Mm.
Moondance is on it, and Crazy Love, which is simple, but it's just genius in its simplicity. And but it's all accessible, it's all simple, it's all sing songable, and it's not dense. And then you have this record, which is poetry on four legs. At least four legs. It might actually be more like eight legs. It might be poetry as an octopus,
Yeah.
in its complexity, in its scope, in the literature of its music, of its ambitions. And so for Morrison to have two of the best kinds of records, this kind of record, and then the kind of record that Moondance is, for him to have two of the best those kinds of records in the same catalog,
Yeah.
shows you that Morrison, and it's too bad Morrison's kind of he's kind of in the same category as a Clapton now, because of his anti-vax status and just his crazy politics, and just he's now become kind of a model for toxic white guy
Yeah.
here in the COVID era in the 2020s, which is too bad because the guy is a stone cold genius, or was a stone cold genius, and deserves to be celebrated and revered, especially for Astral Weeks. I Top 50 might actually be underplaying it. Top 25.
Wow.
I would put it that high, which, obviously the longer we go along, the harder it is to kind of distill things down to a 25. I
Yeah.
still think Astral Weeks belongs in the 25.
Mm. Wow.
Yeah, I think it maintains that position.
Well, all right. So next, now we're gonna do a bullet-ish round.
Yes.
Uh, what a year for big, bloated, indulgent, but still brilliant albums. Uh,
Yes.
a lot of these records that came out, the bigger, heavier, more psychedelic, just hit you in the face stuff. A lot of that came out in 1968, and a lot of them were really great and still hold up. The first one that we're going to go through as quickly as we can. Jimi Hendrix's Electric Ladyland. By the time 1968 was in full swing, Jimi Hendrix was a superstar. His two visionary albums from the previous year catapulted him to worldwide fame, not just on a commercial level, but on an artistic level. He was expanding the parameters of and recreating what one can do with the electric guitar while at the same time creating new subgenres of rock.
Hmm.
Chaz Chandler, the former Animals bassist who discovered him and produced those first two albums, was on board to produce this one as well. But by this time, Hendrix had felt emboldened and sought more creative freedom. Always a perfectionist, Hendrix became increasingly adamant about performing repeated take after repeated take, frustrating his bandmates and Chas Chandler in particular. Another problem going on with Hendrix in the studio was his penchant for inviting friends, hangers on, and groupies to convene and hang out in the studio, transforming what would normally be a professional recording session into an all-night party,
Yep.
Chandler, who provided discipline and diligence to the recording sessions for the previous albums, eventually grew frustrated with the proceedings and quit altogether, leaving Hendrix to produce the whole thing himself. The result was the sprawling double album Electric Ladyland, released in October of 1968. There are some spots where it does get bloated and indulgent, especially the soupy, shapeless, formless 1983 suite on disc 2 and the awkward, underdeveloped Burning of the Midnight Lamp. But there are enough brilliant and inspired moments to warrant the record's double album length. Hendrix veered ever closer to contemporary, for the time, R&B and funk with Crosstown Traffic, Long Hot Summer Night, and Come On. Have You Ever Been to Electric Ladyland is a wonderful homage to Curtis Mayfield and the Impressions. There are two versions of Voodoo Child here. The first one is a lengthy live in the studio jam featuring Steve Winwood on keyboards, which proves that away from the guitar pyrotechnics and showmanship, Hendrix could play straight ahead blues as well as or better than anyone. The second version is the more famous one, with one of the greatest, most iconic intro and guitar riffs of all time, kicking off a celestial slice of sludgy blues rock. And of course, there's Hendrix's majestic version of Bob Dylan's All Along the Watchtower, the highest ranking Hendrix single to hit the US Billboard pop chart, peaking at number 20. It's also one of the most licensed rock songs of all
Oh
time,
yeah.
appearing in countless TV shows as well as movies such as
Forrest Gump.
Forrest Gump,
Yeah.
Watchmen, A Bronx Tale, and Rush. I won't describe it because, trust me, you've all heard it.
Yes.
Needless to say, beyond being the greatest Dylan cover of all time, it's the only Dylan cover to be universally recognized as the definitive version of the song itself. Even Dylan himself has been quoted as saying that whenever he plays the song live, it's done as an homage to Hendrix. In Rolling Stone magazine's most recent list of the 500 greatest albums of all time, Electric Ladyland came in at number 53. While I admit that it's way, way too high of a ranking, the album is a classic and is a sterling example of the bigger, heavier, more psychedelic and exploratory side of 1968. Chris?
I actually don't think that that's too high. I think that this is Hendrix's best record. To your point earlier about how a lot of artists, their double albums tend to be the best thing or the most notable thing that they've done, and it shouldn't be dismissed. Well, I think that this is it's not Exhibit A. It's more like Exhibit G, but it's still up there to me. I mean, I think that the sprawl for me works. I think Hendrix opening his mind and him as a producer and kind of him without as many shackles on is just sort of it's a fascinating ride. You stole my trivia note, by the way. I was going to mention
Yeah.
Stevie Winwood on organ, so
Yeah.
boo. But just think about it, that this album came out about a year and a half after Are You Experienced from '67, and in the span of a year and a half and three albums, where Hendrix was for Electric Ladyland and from where he started. And
Yeah.
mind you, where he started was pretty fucking great.
Yeah.
Obviously, I wouldn't be surprised if I can't remember, but Are You Experienced might actually be higher on that list than the 53 for Electric Ladyland. But
It is.
yeah, and so it's there. But so the distance that he traveled, and then not only that, but then like New Rays of the Rising Sun. which was the album he was working on when he died. And he was heading in a more funk direction. He was getting closer to Curtis Mayfield
Yeah.
than anybody else was. And so the directions that Hendrix in getting more exploratory was starting to explore the black music side of his influences,
Right.
which were always there. But as he went along and as he matured, his explorations got blacker in nature, and especially like the Band of Gypsies when he actually had the black backing band. And he was it's indicative of this is where he was probably going to leave the psychedelic behind, and he was going to get more into the funk and into the soul and into the sort of the Dolly Dagger kind of stuff. Than Easy Rider. Those two songs especially, I think, were kind of indicative of the direction he was going to go in. So it's just, in a way, it makes this record kind of sad because it's amazing, but it's like, oh, what could have been? Oh, what could have been?
Yeah.
It could have been even better. Or it could have gone even further into the vanguard than this, which is
Right.
an extraordinary thing to think about. So, good, great record, great record. It deserves its 53 place on that list.
All right, next, Cream's Wheels of Fire. Now, the other rock guitar virtuoso that was sitting on top of the world, pun very much intended,
Yes.
in 1968 was Eric Clapton and his band Cream. Like Hendrix, they also pioneered a proto-metal sound with a unique sound of Clapton wailing away with his bluesy guitar, while the rhythm section of bassist Jack Bruce and drummer Ginger Baker, both with jazz backgrounds, they would complement Clapton with innovative and inventive, yet still heavy as shit rhythms. After Sunshine of Your Love was a worldwide smash hit in late 1967, Cream immediately got to working on and took considerably more time with the follow-up album to the classic Disraeli Gears. From the very beginning, the album that became Wheels of Fire was planned to be a double album, the first one being all new studio recordings and the second one being live material from recorded concerts. As far as the material goes, if disc one were all that was to Wheels of Fire, one could argue that it would have been Cream's very best album. The band members may have not been getting along due to personality conflicts, but whatever the case, the music on disc one of Wheels of Fire is, well, to use Gen Z parlance, fire. You have White Room, one of the band's signature songs, and another worldwide hit single. It's proto metal at its finest, exhibiting high drama, heavy guitar riffage, soft, aggressive dynamics, and sublimely psychedelic lyrics by the band's sometime contributing lyricist Pete Brown. You have Politician, a dark, lumbering,
Yeah.
menacing piece of heavy blues with a tricky time signature that could even pass as proto grunge. At some point in the future, the young members of Soundgarden were listening to that song. You have Those Were the Days and Deserted Cities of the Heart, shining examples of Cream's gift for combining hard rock with fluid melodicism. The second disc, the live one, is less interesting. Toad is just a glorified, boring 16-minute drum solo by Ginger Baker. Train Time is just a glorified, boring 7-minute harmonica solo by Jack Bruce. However, disc 2 does have a blistering cover of Robert Johnson's Crossroad Blues, titled Crossroads. And in this track, Clapton proves he's one of the greatest guitarists who ever lived. This live version has, through the years, become the definitive version of the song. Yet another double album that justifies its length for the most part. Yet another album that exemplifies the heavier, bigger side of rock in 1968. Chris?
Yeah, White Room is like the one Claptonish song that Martin Scorsese has not appropriated for one of his movies, as far as I know. So thank goodness, because that song still rocks balls, even after I've heard it at least 1,000 times in my lifetime. It's one of the great rock songs of that era or any era. And like you said, it's just neat. It's like just weird lyrics. It's not Swallow Bar level weird, but it's pretty weird. And I actually don't mind the live disc because the live disc is just like it's pure showing off.
Yeah.
Crossroads even, with that guitar solo was kind of showing off in its own way. But like you said, with all the soloing and all that, it's a very show-offy, I can just imagine that Cream must have been like one of the hottest tickets in live music
Yeah.
at that time. They must have been fun to experience live because, it was pretty wild. And so, yeah, you're right. I mean, 16 minutes is a little much.
Yeah.
That probably would, in 7 minutes of harmonica is even worse. If you think about it, but it's still pretty exciting to see what they were capable of there. So, Wheels of Fire, not quite as good as Disraeli Gears, but pretty damn good. A bluesier for sure. I think I
Yeah.
think that the blues end is definitely more pronounced on this record. And especially the guitar. The guitar is more orthodox. You don't get that kazoo shit, uh,
Yeah.
that which I love. My favorite part of this really Gears is how the Clapton somehow gets a kazoo sound out of his
Mm.
guitar in a lot of spots. So anyway, there you go. Wheels of Fire, great album.
All right. Next, the Velvet Underground's White Light, White Heat. On an episode a few years ago, I talked at length about the Velvet Underground's second album and how it is, as I alluded to in my parameter setter for this episode, noise rock taken to the extreme, a gigantic slice of nihilistic, angry punk rock aggression that was way ahead of its time. On the last episode of this series, while discussing the VU's vastly influential debut album, I touched on the unbelievable number of rock subgenres that this band launched, from punk to indie to alternative to goth to shoegaze and to all places in between. I won't go into it too much because I've done so already, but White Light, White Heat, the band's last album featuring bassist, keyboardist, viola player John Cale, is more than just being a proto everything album and a platform for Lou Reed's and Sterling Morrison's decibel busting, ear bleeding, raging guitar noise attack that influenced countless bands in the indie alternative spectrum. It's also about the songwriting and the daring, frankly shocking subject matter in the lyrics. From Lady Godiva's operation story about a sex change operation gone wrong to the Gift's tale about a man who delivers himself in a box to the object of his affection, only to have his skull crushed by a drill gun after she
Nice.
tries to open it, to Sister Ray's story of a heroin-fueled sex orgy between a group of drag queens and sailors where somebody dies and ends up in the cops breaking everything up. One cannot ignore the dark humor in Lou Reed's songs.
Yeah, Ain't Love
Uh,
Grand.
there's also the lingering intelligence and keen eye for description and detail that puts the listener right there in the center of events. Quite possibly rock music's most literary minded songwriter. This album finds Lou Reed at his most lyrically demented and at his most musically explosive. It may not be objectively their best album, but it's probably my favorite. Chris?
Yeah, Ain't Love Grand. That's what you could say about the lyrics. Yeah, when I was 19, you actually, we go back 30 plus years now. You actually introduced me to this record, and my first reaction is, "What the fuck is this shit?" I hated it, and I kind of avoided it for a long time. But as I've gotten older, I've appreciated it now, and I think, the dissonance is purposeful and actually in a odd way kind of beautiful
Yeah.
in terms of how it's shaped. And so it is magnificent noise. And it certainly has grown on me over the years. And yeah, the title track is one of the strongest of the VU songs in their entire catalog.
Yeah.
I dig it.
Yeah. All right. Next. Well, here we go. Frank Zappa. Frank Zappa's most experimental, far out there music came during the 1960s, and nowhere was it more on the edge than in 1968's We're Only in It for the Money. Along with the Velvet Underground, Zappa's band, The Mothers of Invention, were at the foremost of postmodern music in the rock and roll vernacular. That is, merging the avant garde with popular music. Like the VU's John Cale, Zappa had the classically trained background to know what he was doing in regard to construction and deconstruction. To some ears, it may have, and probably still does, sounded like noise, but on We're Only in It for the Money, Zappa created a dizzying tornado of tape loops, feedback, backwards side effects, backwards noise effects, recorded conversations, and actual band interplay that rivaled and resembled the work of extremist composers such as Karlheinz Stockhausen and John Cage. Unlike many of the postmodern composers of the 1950s and early 1960s, Zappa's brand of rock-based avant-gardism was injected with grand doses of humor and satire. The entire album is a fairly loose, conceptual, thematic album that spoofs the hippie counterculture
Yeah.
movement at the time, and pretty savagely, and at that, as evident by the album title. Then there's the album cover, a direct spoof of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper's album cover. The first half of the album is where the majority of Zappa's bile lies. But in the second half of the record, Zappa starts to show a bit more of a soft heart, something he would show less of in ensuing years. Lyrically, he starts to show sympathy for the lost, wayward kids of the hippie era, putting the blame on a generation of parents too occupied with their shallow, vapid, selfish, consumerist lifestyle. You see this in tracks like Lonely Little Girl and What's the Ugliest Part of Your Body.
Hmm.
Unfortunately, on tracks like Harry, You're a Beast, he also tends to point that anger in a misogynist way toward women in general.
Really?
Yeah,
Really?
no, something that, along with the toilet humor he would indulge in from the mid 1970s onward, would go on to form an unfortunate black mark in the man's musical legacy. However, taken as a whole, what at the time was Frank Zappa's magnum opus with the Mothers of Invention, the first iteration of his career. It's dense, musically challenging, audience confronting, thought provoking. It is a masterpiece of conceptual pop art that has, for the most part, stood the test of time for its audacity and forward thinking approach to music composition. Chris?
Yeah, deliciously snotty record.
Yeah.
Even the quote unquote tender stuff is still pretty snotty. Who Needs the Peace Corps? Simply one of the funniest songs ever recorded. I mean, just a wonderful goof on the San Francisco scene, and it even actually kind of goofs on the Dead as well, and kind of points to it the incestuous music scene there. And so really, really, really funny, brilliantly funny. And so Zappa was capable of that. I mean, he's got these funny concept records that run throughout his catalog. This is the least crude of those, but also might be the most incisive. And so, his famous ones are Apostrophe, Chic Your Booty, and Joe's Garage. Right. Apostrophe's got, and Overnight Sensation actually is an accompanying that's got some pretty incisive stuff and some pretty bright stuff too, in addition to some like really, duty toilet, misogynist stuff as well. But this one, it's his least crude, and it's a sophisticated record. It's a sophisticated satire. I would say is the best way to put it, and it's a fun listen. It's a short record too. It's really only I think it's like 32 minutes or something. It's
pushing 40.
Oh, okay, but it flies by. Because it's like 19 songs. That's right. It's like 19 songs, 39 minutes. So it flies by, and again, just really, really funny and really, really bright, but deliciously, deliciously snotty as well.
What is not snotty is the next album.
Yep.
It's the Grateful Dead's Anthem of the Sun, speaking of the dead. We covered this album in detail in the first part of our two-part series from a couple of years ago, The Grateful Dead in the Studio, A Legacy. Needless to say, this is the absolute peak of the Dead's experimental tendencies, and those tendencies resulted in the most overtly psychedelic and really the most outright weirdest record in the band's entire studio discography.
Oh yeah.
It's a part studio, part live album, but nowhere near similar to Cream's Wheels of Fire. On this record, each song is stitched together from recordings culled from sessions from 5 different studios and from 6 different live shows. It's truly a madcap, mad scientist approach to record making. And yes, only a band as off the rails on drugs as the Dead were at the time would attempt to do something like this. Here's the thing, though. It really works, and it feels like a cohesive, coherent record, or at least a cohesive performance. That is, of course, if you can get past the sloppy edits that mark the transition from studio track to live track, as you get with the opening track. That's it for the other one. A lot of the greatness of this album is due to Jerry Garcia's scorching guitar work and
Oh
the
yeah.
thundering complementary rhythms of dual drummers Bill Kreutzmann and Mickey Hart. But boy, was it a hell of a time getting there. The nominal
Yep.
producer of this record, David Hassinger, quit a third of the way through because of the band's constant drug use and even more constant determination to experiment. The last straw for him was reportedly when guitarist Bob Weir wanted to create the illusion of thick air by mixing recordings of silence taken in the desert and the city. Ooh.
Yeah.
The band's touring sound man, Dan Healy, was brought in to co-produce the rest of the album with the Dead themselves. This is the point in the album's creation when the band went on the road to properly road test the material, record the performances, and bring the tapes in and splice them in with their favorite parts together from the studio. And you get what you get here. Kreutzmann probably has the best explanation for the Dead's modus operandi in an excerpt from the book Deal in 2015. Quote, Phil and Jerry were the ones who figured out that we could exploit studio technology to demonstrate how these songs were mirrors of infinity, even when they adhered to their established arrangements. It's the old paradox of improvisational compositions. Jazz artists know all about the balance between freedom and structure, but a few rock bands were now catching on. Most rock bands, however, tended to head in an opposite direction, afraid of the uncertainty of improvisation. We decided that Anthem of the Sun was going to be our statement on the matter. End quote. He would further explain, quote, Jerry Garcia and Phil Lesh went into the studio with Dan Healy, and like mad scientists, they started splicing all the versions together, creating hybrids that contain the studio tracks and various live parts stitched together from different shows, all in the same song. One rendition would dissolve into another, and sometimes they were even stacked on top of each other. It was easily our most experimental record. It was groundbreaking in its time, and it remains a psychedelic listening experience to this day. End quote. And he was damn right about that. Chris?
Yeah, for sure. My line about this record, and I've said it a couple of times in the history of this podcast. I mean, I covered this in our old Vault segment in one of our first episodes, is that it's like it's the equivalent of a shattered stained glass church window.
Yeah.
Where you have all these wonderful pieces, and some of them are small and insignificant, but some of them, like, basically you have like the Jesus head with the sun coming through it in a couple of spots, like the end of the record with some of the the fifth track, which is just the sort of the spooky, where Garcia gets really spooky and starts coming up with all kinds of like weird feedback noise, but it's gorgeous in its own way. It's haunting and gorgeous, and you get some of that. You get some of the double drum solo bits, like the one on Alligator between Hart and Kreutzmann. And so you take all these pieces, and it's earwormy as hell, and you admire it, and it's a really adventuresome listen. Don't come for the songs. There's pieces of songs like, it's all for the other one, I think it's called. It's the
That's it for the other one.
Yeah, that's it for the other one. That's about the first half of that is about the only thing that counts as a song on the record. Although Alligator, I suppose, is okay. That's got a Shel Silverstein lyric in it, by the way. and it's Pigpen and Shel Silverstein, probably the least likely duo of co-lyricists of all time. So again, just picture a pile of stained glass uh, church window pieces, and that's Anthem of the Sun. There you go.
Yeah. And that brings us to our final whacked out album of 1968, The Pretty Things S.F. Sorrow. Now, when the Pretty Things emerged in the so-called British beat scene in 1964, they were considered the B team to the Rolling Stones A team, another
Yeah.
group of middle-class white English boys who played African
Yeah.
American blues and R&B.
Even though one of their founders was an original member of the Stones.
Right. While they would forever be in the shadow of bands such as the Stones, the Who, and the Kinks, they were a better band than the also ran status that they were tagged with. Garage rock classics such as 1965's Buzz the Jerk and 1966's Midnight to Six Man were testaments to the nasty, almost punky edge that the band had. Like a lot of bands of that era, they got psychedelic in the middle of the decade, but the singles they put out were superb and full of sonic invention, full of exotic arrangements and unconventional song structures. Defecting Gray from 1967 and Walking Through My Dreams, great song title, from 1968, were not just brilliant nuggets of righteous psychedelia. They also demonstrated the band's knack for heavy riff rock that predated the direction many other bands would take in the future. Then the Pretty Things decided to get conceptual. If a rock opera / concept album that tracks the life of a man from birth through troubled childhood, through exploratory adolescence, in search for enlightenment, through finding a transcendence sounds familiar, it should. That's basically the story of the Who's legendary concept album Tommy from 1 year later in 1969. It's always a point of contention as to whether the Who actually stole the idea from the Pretty Things. Members of the music critic field, as well as the band members themselves, have ascertained that the album SF Sorrow was a profound influence on Tommy, while members of the Who have always unequivocally denied it. What we do know for sure is that the music on SF Sorrow finds the Pretty Things at the midway point between mind-blowing psychedelic rock and the super heavy riff rock that bands such as Led Zeppelin, Deep Purple, and even the Who would indulge in about a year later. It's one of the truly most underrated albums of this psychedelic era. Chris?
Yeah, absolutely. Really, really, really innovative psychedelia. So you kind of hit the nail on the head. You've got the coloring books of the Beatles and the Pink Floyds of the world mixed with the Who and Deep Purple and that kind of riff heavy chugga-lugga type of rock, and you put them together and you subdue it. I think it's rhythmic, it's catchy, and it's propulsive, but it's subdued. And so it's a very singular record, SF Sorrow, because of that. And one line that I'll give you is that balloon burning. And I have a tough time pronouncing that word. Balloon, as in like hot air balloon burning. It sounds like Can 5 years before Can does.
Yeah.
It's got a little bit of motorique or kind of pre-motorique rhythm going on, and so they had chops. And like I said, one of their founding members was actually for about a month or 2 months was in the Rolling Stones when Richards and Jagger were first kicking around in art school with it. So these guys were good. They never broke. They were treated like stepchildren. And they actually, from what I've read, they had to make a living doing TV music and sort of jingles. It was jingles and TV soundtrack music. They eventually released, and I can't remember what they titled it, but they released a series of albums that kind of compiled all of that stuff, which is like really weird, fun shtick. And they did that throughout the 70s and early 80s. And so they're one of those one of rock's great what could have beens. This album probably deserved more of an audience than it got. And ironically, from what I've read, by the time it reached the shores of the U.S., it was after Tommy had hit. And so now everybody's calling them Tommy ripoffs,
right,
as opposed to the other way around. I don't know. I mean, obviously, the Tommy is a much better record. Nobody in their right mind is going to say SF Sorrow is better than Tommy.
Yeah.
Uh, but yeah, you're right. The coincidences as far as the as far as the Messiah, the modern day Messiah trope,
Yeah. Yeah.
is pretty hard to ignore. So, yeah, good record. Just just a weird mix of things, but innovative and cool. And no sorrow in SF Sorrow, and no SF, by the way, does not stand for San Francisco.
All right, we're
And
done with
so
1968.
and so on a closing note, Arturo, how would you encapsulate the themes, tie it all together, the themes of what we just went through with all these wonderful albums?
Very simple dichotomy, the dichotomy of bigness versus going back to the roots. We talked about the Kinks, Byrds, and the band, and them going back to simplicity. We have all these other, the opposite, big, heavier, more psychedelic of the albums we just mentioned, and then all of that in the same record with the Beatles' White Album.
Yeah, exactly. And I think all of it, including the White Album, it really is a response to 66 and 67, where you
Yeah.
had the psychedelic explosion and sort of the more experimental and things just blowing up. Like again in Technicolor, well, what's next? And so
Right,
either you dial it up even further or try to figure out what the next step is, or you tone it down.
right.
And so I think that's where you get that divergence, is because everybody's trying to, I think that by that point there's a little bit of flower power fatigue that's
Yeah.
going on, obviously with Frank Zappa, sort of capturing that beautifully with his satire.
Mm.
And we're only in it for the money, but it's just everybody's trying to figure out, okay, where do we go from here, and how should we proceed? And so that's where you get this divergence, and it's fascinating. I think
Right.
68 is a fascinating year, and I think it's because of the context that 66 and 67 provide,
Sure.
for
Yeah.
sure. So, and with that, folks, like we always do at the end of these episodes, please go and join our curmudgeonly community on Facebook. Facebook's got its pluses and minuses, but community is one of those pluses, and our community is as alive and well. We've had some participation up there. Arturo, what's coming next? 06?
2006.
Yep, 06 is...
Studio albums of 2006 coming
Yes.
soon.
So that's his studio album. So we've been doing that for almost a year now, maybe even over a year, with these lists. So we're getting there, and find us there at facebook.com/group/curmudgeon rock. If you have anything to say about 1968 or anything else, if you still have lingering feelings about our last episode on hip hop, hit us up at curmudgeonrock@gmail.com. And as a new service, we are now compiling the Spotify playlists that we promise and often put together, and we're publishing them along with the episodes. So wherever you are accessing this podcast, be sure to check out the description and find a link to find us on Spotify. We're actually going to put the entire White Album in that playlist, so we're going to do you a service there. A nice end around on my subscription dollars.